about React and this thing called state. So yesterday, in the past 2 days, we've kind of explored this idea that React is based on components, right? We were taking the screen, we were kind of breaking down the little isolated building blocks so we can kind of rearrange and mess with and kind of have everything in one nice little thing. We know that each component has props. We saw this last night in the homework where we passed props down to a movie component as they're passed down as static, read-only values that are passed from a parent down to a child. Right? Feeling good on that concept? Because that's really good for when we have static data. So when we have data that's not changing at all, props is the solution. But as soon as we have anything that's changing on the page at all, like if we have a timer, if we have a countdown, if we have a carousel, if we have an AJAX request like we saw yesterday, we have something that's now going to be changing on the page, that is where we need to use something called state. So what is state? State is a lot of things. State is, first off, used to store values local only to that component that can be updated to re-render the page. So you know how we have that render function? And that render function is called only once, right? Whenever it's added to the page. Well, now with state, whenever we update state, whenever we change state, that render function is going to be called again. So now I have this thing called state, this object called state, that whenever we update that, we're now re-rendering the page. This idea of JavaScript data changes, update the page, JavaScript data changes, update the page, that's something called one-way data binding. So that says that as soon as something JavaScript changes, so like we get a new value, our array is now populated. Our counter goes from 3 to 5. We're going to re-render the entire page. And by the entire page, I mean just that component. State can be used, and typically is used, as a starting point to pass data into child components. So yesterday, we passed data into movie objects, or the villain objects, from some local variable inside of the parent component, right? We'd like let villains equals data from the JSON file. Well, instead of using that, now we can use the state to pass data down to child components as props. So that's that bridge from a new dynamic data to something a bit more static. So now our child components are pretty much now all about just displaying data, while the parent component is where all the logic is happening. Yeah, it's really kind of nice. How are we feeling so far?
Could you repeat that one thing about where the logic is contained to the parent?
Yeah, so the logic is contained to the parent. So in your homework last night, the logic you can think of is loading up the data, right? And that happened in probably a movies component or a movies list component, right? But what's actually displaying the movie is a child component called movie. So now the actual display logic is separated away from the actual logic of the app. So like yesterday in class, we did the villains app, right? We had a villains list, which loaded up the JSON file. But what actually produced the HTML, what actually showed the data, was a villain component. So now with state, the state of the villains, the actual like data itself that's going to be changing, is going to be stored in the villains, in the parent container. But the actual display logic is going to be in the child component. Does that help?
Yeah, that's great.
So here's the kicker. State is immutable, right? See some eyebrows raising. We're like, hey, state's for dynamic data, state's for things that change. Well, actually, state is something that's called, it's immutable. That means that state itself doesn't change. whenever we want to go update the state, what we have to do is actually replace the state with the new one. So it's not a go in and tweak it, it's go in and replace it.
Why?
It's a great question, right? It's really cool for a variety of reasons. The biggest one is that it prohibits an entire section of bugs. Because now our state is it's immutable, it's always going to be a thing. And when we update it, we don't have to worry about, do we have the old state, do we have the new state, are we updating 2 or 3 things at a time, 5 things at a time? We're always dealing with the latest changes.
So it's like a repository that closes every single time you need it. You have to reopen it in order for it to lose function.
It may seem a bit weird, like that's a whole extra headache, we can't like directly update it, we have to replace it. But it actually kind of makes sense a little bit. It gives us a little bit of natural structure to our program to make our programs a bit more debuggable and a bit more friendly for us.
And there's less ways of losing what your codes are. Right?
Because really, if state is mutable, if we can go in and change state, if me as the render function, I'm working off the current state to render something else, and all of a sudden state changes halfway through that, I have a weird race condition where the first half of my render function is using my old state, and the next half is using the new state. So it creates a really weird thing there. Unless we make it immutable, then we're always using the latest and greatest.
Is there a different way you can do it without having to start all over?
No. It feels weird because changing, but it's immutable. But actually, once you see it in action, it makes a lot of sense. It's just there's a few things like dealing with arrays and stuff like that like we'll see that. So speaking of seeing it, here's a basic state example. It'll look a lot like props, right? We have a person component, has a constructor, and inside of that constructor is where we are initializing the state. We're saying, hey, this.state is an object, and it has one property, age. Age, of course, changes as we go. But if we look down on the render function, we have an h2 that says, I am squiggles, this.state.age. So that's me using the state to actually create my HTML.
So that's the header.
Yeah, it's a header.
So constructor props, super props, is that technically written once per component?
Yes. So that's a whole bunch of noise, a little bit of extra noise when dealing with state and React and components. We'll go over a shortcut way later today how to kind of reduce that noise. But all that's saying, it's saying, hey, whenever I make a new person, this new person is going to be passed props.
Oh.
I also want to call the constructor, that's what the super is doing. The super is calling the constructor of its parent with those same props.
So this would be like the person's component.
Yep.
The person itself would be that block. Okay.
Oh,
So the super is for
React our component.
React.
This is calling the constructor of this with the exact same properties. These 2 lines are pretty much extra noise and ceremony that will be there whenever you use a constructor in React.
What is the constructor for?
The constructor is what's run whenever a object is created. So we use it to set initial values, new things inside of it, stuff like that. It's like an initializer. And we're just saying when we create a new person, take the props that we're passing it, also pass it to the parent. But then after we do that, initialize our state with these values. So whenever we create a new person, they're going to be starting off at age 36. So not only can we render this out, but we can also pass the state as props down to a child. So remember how I said like the logic's being stored someplace else, and typically child components are now going to be more display based. Well, here's an age display component. It doesn't matter what it does or what's inside of it. But we're passing the state of the parent, a person class, a person component, into a child component.
When you say could you repeat the part of the constructor in super? What do you mean? What we need to put over there?
So, like, why the constructor is here
Yeah, in super. In super,
and super.
yeah.
So the constructor, let's kind of forget about the super for a second. The constructor itself is where we initialize data for that class. So we're saying,
they call the parent. You say the
Mhm.
component.
Yep.
Component.
so we're just saying, hey, whenever we create a new person, also initialize the parent stuff.
The component.
Is the parent, yes.
Okay, thank you.
So the age display, the age is from this state.
Yep. So we're going to take the state of the parent and pass it down as props to the child age display. So down in age display, it'd be this dot props.age.
You were talking before about how essentially state re-renders the page, or at least that component.
Mm-hmm.
Do you need to explicitly put the render function back in? Is that left out for now because we're not changing anything, or is state just it understands to re-render?
As long as it's called render, we're going to get to, on the next slide, we're going to actually update the state. And whenever we update the state, it's going to call this render function.
That's the
So it's on standby.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right now it's rendered out and it's kind of waiting for something to happen. So that segues great into updating state. So here we have a person inside of the constructor. We're saying, hey, this person has the last name of tenant. All right, that's all fine and dandy. We are rendering it down here. And then we have a function inside of it called update last name. So whenever this gets called for whatever reason, we have something new here. We have this dot set state. Remember how I said that state is immutable and can't be changed? Well, this dot set state is how we change states, how we update state.
So it's a loop.
Yeah, it's like a loop. It's kind of like here's what we do, and here's how we're getting around that state is immutable. So this dot set state comes because we inherit from a component. And what this is a function that takes an object, and that object is now the new state. And when I say the new state, it's merged with the old state to create the next state. So we see here our original state has one property, last name. So whenever we new this up, it's going to render it with that state with one property. Then whenever we call this dot set state, it's going to create the new state. So now this new state has two properties. Last name is now Smith, and his maiden name is Tenant. And then it's going to recall render. So this dot set state will trigger the page to the component to render.
Right now, in update last day you are creating and also changing.
Mm-hmm.
You're creating a field.
Yep.
And changing.
Yep. So this is going to. So what this is doing, this is going. Hey, do I have a last name inside of my state? I do. So I'm going to update the value for you. I'm going to change it for the new state to be Smith instead of whatever it was. It's going. Hey, do I have maiden name in my state? No. Well, then I'm just going to add it to my state. So this dot set state allows you to add properties to your state as well.
So you can add a key and value for set state.
Yep.
And I what happens if we don't have the construction in
Uh,
New York?
If you don't have the constructor, you have,
Initializer?
yeah, then state is not initialized to anything, so state doesn't exist.
So so with state, we have to have this class extends component.
Mhm.
So everything within now is going to be within that curly brackets.
Yep.
And we would also still do like import, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. All the other like the importing noise and the exporting stuff is still there.
Yeah.
I just left it out for us.
Right. Okay.
I got to think about how can I
Yeah.
ask that question. Do I have to write down in my code when I have a dynamic data?
Mhm.
I have to use that instead props.
Yep. Props are static read-only things. State is where we can actually change values and go. The biggest hurdle students typically have is when to use state and when to use props.
Yeah.
Like that's going to be the challenge.
The way I like to think about props and state are props are things that are given to me by my parent, and state are things that I create myself.
Mhm.
So props are handed to me like the inheritance I get from my parents, right? They like my parents give me money, right?
Mhm.
And state is like the money that I earn myself. Right? Because you see in this case, right, the person is creating their own last name. We're not getting it from props. We're not getting it from our parent. Maybe there's like an app component or a list that says, "Hey, person, this is your age or this is your name." That would be a prop. But if the component itself creates the data, then it's state.
So state is basically where if the user can interact with it and change things on the website, then that's state. But if they can't do anything to it, it's a problem.
It's more about like the fact that in React things are nested, right? We talk about parents and children. You have a component and it has a child component. If the parent is sending things down to the child, they get sent down as props, right? If the component itself needs to create its own information, in this case the last name, right? That's a hard-coded thing that the component created itself. But what if that last name came from an API call? Maybe we need to reach out to the internet and ask, what's this person's last name? That would be state because we are creating and fetching that data. So you have to think about it on a component by component basis. Does this component receive information? Cool, that's props. Does this component create information? Cool, that's state. Okay? And the reason why we have the constructor there is because sometimes we take the data that comes to us as props and we use it to create state. Right? That's why we have, that's how those two things get tied together. Just remember, props are things that are passed to you. State is something that you either create or modify. I think that's a pretty good rule of thumb. It's like 99% accurate.
Mm-hmm. So with this kind of idea that now we have re-rendering happening, we have stuff changing, this naturally leads into something that we're going to start talking about next couple of days, is the React component lifecycle. So there's a whole suite of events that happen whenever a component gets loaded to the page. We did a little bit of looking at this yesterday with component did mounts. And we'll explore more as the days come on, but let's kind of look at component did mounts. This is the one you'll probably be using the most, to be completely honest. This is the event that I like to think of it as like my DOM content loaded for that component. So, I mean, you can read that, and that's the technical definition of it. But the more plain English is, hey, once this component is added to the page, run this code. So like yesterday, whenever we had the villains, we're like, hey, whenever this component is on the page, go out to my API, grab my data, and load it up.
So it's kind of like how when we first started JavaScript and stuff, and it would have like the DOM content loaded,
Yep.
but in this case it's for the specific thing being added to the page rather than the whole page being loaded.
Exactly. So now a full example. It actually has a scroll bar. So here's a component for a clock that will count. That will count and display the current time. So whenever I load it up, it's going to say that it is 10:32:35, and it will tick every second. Kind of like the opposite of what the countdown timer did for the weekend's homework. So we have a clock. We say, hey, whenever we create the new clock, initialize it to right now. That's whenever we're actually setting our state. And we use state here because this is data that we're going to be generating. And by we, I mean the clock component. The clock component is going to be generating it. It's going to be in charge of that. And it's going to be changing over time. Because, of course, clocks tick forward in time. And then once we have our component did mount, then we're going to call this method called tick. And we're going to start that tick every second. And what this tick function is doing, this tick function is just saying, hey, update set state, update the state with the new value. So every time this gets called this set state, it's then it's going to re-render the page with the current time. Because that render is going to look at the current state and grab the date and then display that. Let's take a minute to digest this. And what thoughts do we have about this?
So when I was working on the timer for the weekend homework
Mhm.
last weekend, I was looking at set interval and I saw a thing that was like a clear interval that tells it when to stop.
Mhm.
I didn't use that, but when I tried using set interval, it just basically like crashed everything. Like it just, I don't know, like it was saying I was like, using up all my memory. I needed to close all these apps and stuff. So I didn't know if the lack of a clear interval that sometimes was like a problem there, but I didn't see it here.
Yeah, probably because you were adding more
Mm-hmm.
without clearing the velocity.
Okay. But would this do that then if it doesn't clear, or is it since it's not adding, it's just setting it once?
Yeah, I probably should, if I'd actually use it, I probably would have to clear it.
Okay.
Yeah.
But this is just kind of a simplified example.
Yeah, every time you use set interval, you should use clear interval.
Yeah.
Because you only have 255 of them in your browser total. So once you use one, if you don't clear it until that tab goes away, you'll run out of those resources.
Why 255?
I just think that's the number they chose. I think that might be right. We don't use intervals that often, so I don't think they give you very many of them.
Yeah.
It's not a pretty common thing.
That
It's
sounds like,
also 2 to the 8 minus 1.
Yeah.
so it sounds like it was maybe some technical restriction back in the day, and it's like stuck with it.
Well, it's 2 to the 8 minus 1, so I was wondering if that was why.
That's probably the technical restrictions, right? So we have this many bytes, this much memory to dedicate to intervals.
Interesting.
So then is there a different way to do timer if that's sounds outdated?
If you have 250 some intervals on your website, you're probably doing something wrong. To be completely honest.
And that may not be the limit anymore.
Yeah.
And there's also other technologies to use, but set interval for something that's like, I need this to happen every second is the most common.
Yeah.
Does,
I have a question.
Yeah.
When we load the page, what happened first? Is the component did mount?
Yeah, so what happens first
The
is the
because I think
constructor runs first,
okay.
and then actually the render happens next.
First?
Yep.
Okay.
And then we're like, hey, the component did mount. So now we're gonna run this. So 1, 2, 3. And then of course 4, 5, 6.
And tick is called set interval is just it's setting the interval and it's applying.
Mm-hmm.
You're just calling. I'm trying to. You're not storing it in tick. You're saying it's set interval.
Yep.
Then run.
Then I'm run this function tick,
Right. Okay.
which is this is actually what's storing it inside a state.
Every time when they call, they update the render.
And
So-
just the new data that's built in, right? That it's
It's a
actually
JavaScript, yeah.
pulled up. Okay.
So, oh wait. State, this is state is up top equals.
Yep.
And tick this set state. Basically, what you're doing is it's up. I'm confused about that a little bit.
So I feel like you're close because you almost said it.
I know, I was gonna say
Yeah, you're super close. So we're initializing state up here. We're saying whenever we start off,
Uh-huh.
the time is right now.
Okay,
Every time we call tick, we're
that's what,
updating, we're setting the state
okay.
with the new current time.
So it's on standby as well?
Yep.
That's what, okay.
Yes.
This state, what does this mean?
So,
this
yep.
in relation to clock?
Yes, this means the current class, the current component. So this will be the clock.
What is the homework?
The homework? It's a fun project this weekend. I actually really do like. This isn't like the crazy definition of it's gonna be terrible kind of fun. Like I actually really enjoy this homework. But we'll talk about it
Is
in
it
about
like all the world clocks?
Is that the scoreboard one that you mentioned?
the what?
Is it the scoreboard one you mentioned?
No, we're gonna be doing that together in class today. It's actually a preview is it's a color picker.
Interesting.
Oh.
Yeah.
It's not like Times Square.
Yeah, it's nothing crazy. I mean, it's fun, but nothing crazy.
Whenever you say it's a fun project, it was so difficult.
Yeah. It is kind of difficult, but it's the good kind of difficult.
But we can utilize the color picker then, right?
There are sliders and stuff. It's in the homework. You'll see it.
We won't be able to use it forever.
Oh yeah, forever. Yeah. So how are we feeling with state and set state?
I like the concept.
Yeah, at least conceptually. Feeling ready to see it kind of in action now? All right. It's 10:40. Let's take our break a little bit early today then, and come back at 10:50, and we'll actually build the scoreboard in React.